Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Hey, welcome back everybody. This week's episode is a bite-size episode, which is a shorter chunk of a longer episode you may have missed. And the interesting thing about this one is it's not an episode of Bluegrass Jam Along. It's an episode of a podcast called Mandolins and Beer, which is run by Daniel Patrick and is a fantastic podcast. And the reason I'm putting out a chunk of it is because I am the guest on it. Daniel's been on Bluegrass Jam Along a couple of times, talking about his last record, but also talking about Mike Marshall's Into the Cauldron. And he said, do you want to come on and have a chat about Bluegrass Jam Along and how you got started and, you know, how the podcast sort of came about and all of that stuff. And I thought it'd be really fun because one of the things people ask me more than anything is like, how did an English guy get into bluegrass? How did you start playing this music? Why did you start a podcast? Those kinds of things. And we cover all that. It was a really fun chat. We talked for an hour about how I got into bluegrass music, what the records were that really got me interested. About the first mandolin, which I got given as a present. We chat about how the podcast started, how it developed, how I started interviewing, all sorts of stuff. And the bit about how the podcast started and my sort of approach to interviewing is the bit that I'm going to put in here. It's about 10 minutes of it. I hope you enjoy it. If you want to hear the full interview and find out about that first mandolin, about how I got into bluegrass in the first place, if you want to hear what my favourite beer is, because it's obviously mandolins and beer, and Daniel asks everybody that question, I'll stick a link in the show notes. Go to Mandolins and Beer podcast. It's on all the podcast platforms. But I'll stick a link in the show notes and go and check out the full episode. I hope you enjoy this. I hope you find it fun finding out a little bit more about me. I will be back next week with a proper episode with an actual guest that isn't me. I hope you enjoy this. In the meantime, have a great week and happy picking.
How you started with this podcast is you started doing backing tracks for people to start kind of having something to play along. Let's talk a little bit how that started up for you.
So like everybody, I was at home a lot during the pandemic and just found myself, I'd gone through a bit of a break of not really playing a lot of music. Life got busy, work, family, all sorts of things, and just hadn't played much. And then found myself at home with a bit more time and found myself picking up the mandolin and the guitar more and wanting to learn some more tunes. And so I thought, well, there's nobody to jam with. Maybe I'll just make myself some backing tracks to play along to. And then I figured, actually, most of the time at a jam session, you're playing rhythm. Like you're playing backup, you're not playing the tune. But every backing track out there is of the chords for you to play the tune over. Nobody's putting out backing tracks of tunes for you to play backup to. So I just thought, I'm going to make myself a bunch of tracks. And then I thought, well, if I can use these, probably other people can use them. And so I just started putting them out on a podcast. So for each tune, there'll be me just playing the tune 4 times so you can play backup, a separate track of me playing the chords so you can play the tune, and then I thought, well, why don't I do a third one where I swap between the two so you can jam with it? And that's just sort of how it started, really, making them for me and thinking other people might like these too.
Such a great idea. And that's one of the things that is so underrated. And like you said, like most of the time you're playing in a jam, I mean, except for your break, maybe your second break, it's just rhythm. And so many people forget about how important, like when John Reichman says he's still working on his chop, you should realize that how important being a good rhythm player is, a good backing player is, when a guy like that, an absolute legend, is like still working on making that better.
Yeah. And, the amount of people I've interviewed for the podcast, particularly guitarists who talk about like rhythm guitar, and I've talked to so many people about Tony Rice, and the thing they all say is his rhythm playing. Like they love the leads, but the rhythm. And Jake Workman was on the podcast last week, and he was saying, yeah, like he thinks the reason he lasted so long with Kentucky Thunder was Ricky Light playing over his rhythm. It's not about the breaks. It's about being able to hang for the other 95% and do something the other person wants to bounce off. And things like, Sam Bush's chop Chris Eldridge said to me at one point that Sam Bush's chop should be the eighth wonder of the world. It's like, it's just this hewn out of granite thing that just makes all music sound better.
So then you started doing these incredible interviews with like such great musicians. I would assume, these people are pretty approachable. I would imagine, London doesn't make any difference now with the internet as far as getting connected with people. Was it pretty easy for you then to start, setting up interviews and at the beginning?
Yeah, I'd sort of thought maybe it's time to start doing some interviews, and I don't really know how to do it, but I'm just gonna. And I've been speaking to Marcel from Lessons with Marcel about swapping links on our websites. And I said, "Would you fancy coming on at some point and just talking to me?" And he said, "Yeah, sure." So I'd kind of got that as a plan, and then out of the blue, I got an email from Jake Eddy. We were in a similar bluegrass guitar Facebook group, and he'd seen that I had this podcast. He went, "Do you want to interview me? I've got a record out." I was like, "Cool, why not?" And so that was my first interview with Jake Eddy, and he was still playing with Becky Buller at that point, and was just starting to really take off as a thing in his own right. And so I did that. Then I interviewed Marcel, and then the third one was Bryan Sutton. And then after that, once you've had Bryan Sutton on the podcast, most people are going to say yes to you.
Yeah, yes. That once you have, like, you get that, like, mine was Mike Marshall, and like Mike Marshall, I woke up to an email from Mike Marshall. I'm like, whoa. And once you have that, it's a little bit easier to be like, oh, who have you had on so far? And you're like, oh, So,
and Mike's such a great guest. He's just so engaged and he's a fascinating guy.
He's a fountain of information in so many styles of music. That's the other crazy thing too, is like he could talk to you about choro, classical, mandocello only, mandolin, guitar. He's great at everything.
It's annoying, isn't it?
Yeah, it's frustrating. How do you do that? But for him, it's just, I don't know, just do it. And he's right. I guess that really is. If you dedicate as much time as he does, and has his entire life, I guess you start slightly getting maybe to some of that territory.
And I was going to say that's just been the thing. It's just enjoying those conversations so much, because musicians are just so passionate about what they do and so kind of deep in their knowledge. I just ended up not doing the backing tracks anymore, because I have this never-ending list of people I want to talk to who keep saying yes.
It's amazing. And I love too, like, because you get to, like, I love to interview other musicians, but I also, with a podcast that's called Mandolins and Beer, it's got to really kind of correlate. It's really cool to hear you talk to some of these players that I also admire musically, Yeah,
it's fascinating, because we've got a kind of a bit of an overlap in the guests we've had on. And what I love about it is because we've got a different kind of energy. You get a different kind of conversation.
Completely different, for sure. And I love listening to, after I've had a guest on, like hearing them on your podcast, because I learned something new too, I'm like, oh, what a great question. So
I think that's the thing, is particularly people who've been on a lot of podcasts. Like if you're going to interview, I don't know, Sierra Hull or Sarah Jaros or somebody who's been on lots of podcasts, I don't want the same interview they're giving somebody else. I want something a bit, and if I hear somebody on 3 different podcasts, I don't want to hear the same interview. So I'm constantly looking for things to ask that, well, I guess, you'll be the same, but all you really do is ask the things you're interested in and presume that other people are interested as well.
Yeah, one of the things I used to do too, I used to write down, like, I had such a rigid format, I felt, and then I found that I was like leaving out the chance to ask deeper questions about something that might have just been talked about, because I was so worried about trying to get in the other 10 questions that were, in hindsight, pretty generic on my part. I guess maybe that comes with talking with people and doing more and more of these, and then, getting feedback from people too. And so it makes it a little bit easier too to like delve deeper into certain things, because, you and I might understand a kind of a reference that is musical, where you're like, oh, you got to play in between the beat, or play behind the metronome, and I know what that means, but like not all the listeners might. So that's, it's like a great time to be like, well, what do you mean by behind the metronome? Like, how do you approach that? And hopefully somebody can be like, oh man, I finally understand what that means.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I was missing that sort of thing by having my little list of questions. And I still have a small one, obviously, but I really do try to freeform it as much as possible now, and just try to make it as conversational as possible, as opposed to like, quote unquote, an interview.
Yeah, I think about it as in the same way as jamming with people. And when you're new to jamming, you have a bunch of stuff ready. You might even have some breaks prepared and you deliver them because that's what you're comfortable with. But as you get better at it, you learn to listen to the other people and follow what they're doing or maybe nudge them in a direction or whatever. And I like to think of the interviews as being essentially me playing backup to somebody who people have come to listen to. And I can influence things and I can bring a performance out of them and I can help them get to a certain place. But they're the star attraction. Do you know what I mean? And it just helps me hang at the right level in there sometimes.
For sure. Yeah, that's the thing, man. Like I try to edit as much of me out.
It's really funny when I go back and I edit my podcasts in GarageBand and I go back and I look at how much of the waveforms are taken up by my voice and the other person's voice. And there's a kind of real sweet spot. And sometimes, like with the Jake Workman one last week, I wasn't in it all that much because he's just really good at taking something and running with it. And then some other people will give you shorter answers. You find you're in there more often. But yeah, if there's more of me in there than somebody else, I know I've not been doing my job properly.
Yeah, exactly. Did you read any books on interviewing or anything like that? Or did you just listen to podcasts and just kind of like, well, I mean, I've got questions I want to ask these people anyway. And I think people will probably be interested in that.
Yeah. And I've been interviewed a bit for my day job. Like I'm sort of our media spokesperson. So I've been interviewed. So I understand how that feels. And yeah, I just sort of ask the questions that I want to know about really. And I try and avoid when did you first get an instrument? Unless it's somebody who's maybe not that well known, and we'll dig back. But it's a bit like I don't know about you, but if I read a biography, I don't want to start with the day they were born and what their parents did for a living. Like I want to start with them being whatever they are, and then go back to that. You know, if it's interesting or relevant in some way. You know, I don't want to get through 15 chapters before anything happens, and I feel like that with an interview. Cool. Hope you enjoyed that. If you want to hear the full thing, go to Mandolins and Beer. There's links in the show notes. Go and check it out and listen to some of Daniel's other episodes. It's a really cool podcast. Really enjoy listening to that one. But that is it for this week. I will see you next time. Have a great week and happy picking. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.